Travis Reynolds had everything a man could want. Mansions sprawling across oceanside hills, a fleet of sports cars polished so frequently they gleamed like silver fire, and a social circle tighter than a vault, built from the same breed of trust fund elites and country club royals. But what he had in wealth, he lacked in empathy. Cruelty came easy to Travis. It was woven into the fibers of his designer suits, dripped from the rims of his vintage wine glasses, and echoed in the laughter of his Friday night poker games. It was during one of these games, held in the private lounge of his penthouse overlooking the skyline, that the bet was made. The whiskey was flowing, the stakes were high, and egos even higher. "I could marry a rat and turn her into a diamond," Travis boasted, smugly throwing down a royal flush. "Even the dirtiest, ugliest creature on the street. I'd have her cleaned up, trained, dressed, and displayed like a trophy within a week." His friends, equally desensitized to morality, howled with laughter, but one of them, Damien, leaned forward with a crooked grin. "Then prove it. 1 week. Find the ugliest beggar in this city and marry her. Don't just clean her up. Marry her. If you do, I'll give you the keys to my Aspen villa." The room erupted. The bet was on. The next morning, Travis had his assistant cancel meetings and called in a chauffeur. He wasn't just looking for any homeless person. This was an exhibition. He needed someone who would shock, someone grotesque enough to make a statement. He began his hunt through alleys, under bridges, outside shelters. He passed dozens, snapping photos and sending them to his friends for laughs, eliminating candidates like he was swiping on an app. But then he saw her. Sitting alone on a curb by a rundown train station was a woman whose very presence seemed to repel the light. She had long, matted hair that fell like seaweed around her face, skin smudged with city grime, and wore a coat so tattered it clung to her like a second skin. But it wasn't her appearance that struck Travis. It was her stillness. She didn't beg, didn't speak, didn't even blink as he approached. She just looked at him, eyes vast and hollow, like 2 dark wells where memories had drowned. Travis knelt and offered her money. She didn't flinch. He offered food, no response. A hotel room? Still nothing. Frustrated but intrigued, he decided to test a different tactic. He returned the next day, and the day after that, each time sitting beside her without a word. He brought her coffee, left new clothes beside her, even paid a violinist to play near the corner. On the 4th day, she finally moved. She reached for the coffee without looking at him. "My name's Travis," he said gently. She gave no reply. "Do you have a name?" Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Her eyes flickered downward. "Let's make a deal," Travis continued, seeing an opening. "If you come with me just for 1 day, I'll give you whatever you want: money, shelter, a bed, food, clothes. 1 day. No strings attached." She stared at him, expression unreadable. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. He took her to his private suite on the upper floor of the Rosemont Hotel, where she showered for what seemed like an hour. When she emerged, wrapped in a white towel, Travis was stunned. Not because she was beautiful, because she wasn't by conventional standards, but because she looked human now, haunted and fragile, yes, but not invisible. "What's your name?" he asked again. She still didn't speak. Instead, she wrote a single word on the hotel notepad: Clara. It was all he needed. The next 3 days were a blur. Travis brought in stylists, nutritionists, and even a therapist. Clara endured it all in silence. She didn't resist, but she didn't engage either. She just existed, a hollow sculpture slowly being polished. Despite her reticence, something about her unnerved Travis. Her eyes always seemed too aware, too deliberate, like she was seeing more than he was saying. The wedding was set for Friday, just 6 days after the bet had begun. Travis's friends were giddy with anticipation, waiting to see this cruel circus come full circle. Clara remained quiet through it all, her silence now more commanding than his arrogance. On the eve of the wedding, Travis stood before the mirror adjusting his cufflinks when he caught a glimpse of Clara in the reflection. She was watching him. No smile, no emotion, just watching. For a fleeting second, he felt a ripple of something unfamiliar. Not guilt, but unease. He pushed it aside. He'd won the bet, hadn't he? This was about the game, not the girl. But in the pit of his stomach, a single question echoed. Who exactly had he invited into his life? The wedding day arrived cloaked in a strange sense of dread, as if even the sun chose not to shine in protest. Clouds swirled thick over the city skyline, casting an eerie gray light on the marble steps of the Reynolds estate, where the private ceremony was to take place. Travis had spared no expense, booking a celebrity chef for the catering, renting white doves for the photo shoot, and instructing the florist to use only blood-red roses. Part mockery, part metaphor. The guest list was curated with a specific kind of cruelty, filled with socialites, CEOs, and minor celebrities, all eager to witness the spectacle firsthand. To them, this wasn't a wedding. It was performance art staged by a bored millionaire with too much money and too little empathy. Clara, the bride, remained a ghostly presence among it all, moving silently through the makeup and dressing process, never flinching, never smiling. She wore a modest ivory dress that Travis's stylist insisted on, one that clung to her awkwardly but managed to amplify the contrast between her disheveled roots and the high-gloss luxury surrounding her. As the violin quartet played something classical and cold, Travis stood at the altar, checking his watch, smirking as his friends raised their champagne flutes to him from the front row. When Clara appeared at the end of the aisle, a hush fell over the gathering, not out of reverence but shock. She didn't look like a bride. She looked like a ghost wandering into the wrong reality. Her shoulders were too narrow for the gown. Her hair, though washed and combed, still carried the memory of dirt and shadows, and her expression. It was vacant, unreadable, like she was somewhere else entirely. Yet she walked with a steady, unnerving grace, unbothered by the stares, the smirks, the snapping of discreet photos. She moved as if she had walked that path before, in a different life, a different world, one that bled into this moment like a whisper on the edge of hearing. The ceremony proceeded with hollow precision. The officiant, a friend of Travis's who doubled as a corporate lawyer, read the vows with dry sarcasm barely concealed beneath a smile. Travis, ever the showman, recited his lines with theatrical flair, even ad-libbing a few jokes that drew laughter from the audience. When it was Clara's turn, there was a pause. Everyone leaned forward, but she said nothing, not even a nod. Instead, she reached into the sleeve of her gown and pulled out a small piece of paper. It was handwritten, in delicate cursive. She handed it to the officiant, who read it aloud, voice faltering halfway through. I accept this union not for love, but for truth. Let what is hidden come to light. The guests exchanged glances, some whispering, others chuckling nervously. Travis forced a smile, his jaw tight. He hadn't expected drama from her. He thought she was mute, thought she was harmless. But Clara merely turned her face upward, staring at him with those deep, hollow eyes that now seemed to reflect something darker than sadness. Something ancient, perhaps even aware. The kiss was a brief, awkward brush, met with scattered applause and uncomfortable laughter. After the ceremony, the guests moved into the estate ballroom, where waiters flowed with trays of canapés and champagne. Travis mingled, soaking up attention, pretending not to notice that Clara had disappeared from the reception entirely. When he asked one of the staff where she had gone, they said she had returned to the bridal suite without a word. Travis chuckled, waving it off. She's probably overwhelmed, being Cinderella and all. But his tone lacked conviction. Beneath the bravado, something gnawed at him. That note, her stare, the eerie calm she carried like a shroud. It all felt too deliberate, too composed. Later that night, when the guests had trickled out and the jazz band packed up, Travis made his way to the suite where Clara was staying. He entered expecting awkwardness, maybe an uncomfortable attempt at intimacy, or even tears. What he found was silence, and a strange scent in the air, like old wood and forgotten perfume. Clara was sitting at the vanity, still in her gown, staring at her reflection without blinking. The room was untouched, no champagne glasses, no open gifts. Just her and that silence that now felt oppressive. You planning to sleep in that thing? Travis joked, trying to lighten the mood. She didn't turn. Instead, she raised one hand and pointed toward the far side of the room. There, placed neatly on the floor, was an old wooden trunk. It hadn't been there earlier. "Is that yours?" he asked, walking toward it. Still no answer. The trunk was heavy, ornate, and covered in carvings he couldn't quite decipher. Symbols, patterns, letters in a language that looked almost Slavic. He reached for the latch, but it wouldn't open. Locked. He turned back to Clara, who had finally stood, now walking slowly toward the bed. She sat on its edge, hands folded in her lap like a doll waiting to be posed. Travis, unsure why he was suddenly sweating, turned on the television to cut through the tension. Static. Every channel. He flipped through dozens, each one the same screeching white noise. The remote slipped from his hand. Clara finally spoke. 1 year ago, in this very room, someone died. Her voice was low, almost melodic. They screamed for help, but no one heard, because they chose not to. Travis froze, heart thudding in his chest. "What are you talking about?" he asked. But Clara didn't reply. Instead, she stood, walked to the trunk, and knelt beside it. She placed both hands on it, murmured something under her breath, and the lock clicked open. Inside was not what he expected. Not clothes, not keepsakes, but photographs. Dozens, maybe hundreds, each one featuring a young girl in various stages of childhood. Playing violin, reading books, posing with awards. Then came the darker ones. Newspaper clippings, headlines about a missing heiress, a fire at an estate, rumors of family betrayal. At the very bottom, there was a single photo of Travis's father, much younger, standing beside a man who looked disturbingly familiar, Clara's father. Travis stumbled back, suddenly nauseated. Clara was now watching him closely, her gaze stripped of all its former vacancy. It was sharp now, burning, alive. "This wasn't a wedding," she whispered. "It was an unveiling." Then she turned away, leaving him standing in the middle of a room that now felt colder than death, surrounded by ghosts he never knew existed, and truths he had no idea were buried so close to home. The hours after the wedding stretched out like a slow, relentless march toward something unspeakable. Travis had returned to the master suite sometime after midnight, still half drunk on champagne and adrenaline, expecting awkward silence or a brief, cold conversation with Clara. What he walked into instead was a scene that unsettled him to his core. The lights were dimmed, casting long shadows across the walls, and every mirror in the room, there were 5 of them, had been covered with white bedsheets. Clara sat cross-legged in the center of the bed in her nightgown, her back to him, humming a strange, lilting tune that made his skin prickle. She stopped the moment he stepped inside, as though sensing his presence without seeing him. "You don't have to pretend to be scared of me," he muttered, trying to push down the unease twisting in his gut. "You already won. You're rich now. Congratulations." She didn't move, didn't even flinch. "The game hasn't started," she said quietly, her voice rasping like dry paper. "Not yet." Travis scoffed, forcing a chuckle, but it died quickly in his throat. Clara turned slowly to face him, her hair parted down the middle like a curtain drawn back to reveal a face so calm it felt unnatural. "You said this room was your favorite," she said, motioning around them. "Do you know why?" Travis blinked. "Because it's got a heated floor and the biggest bathtub in the house?" Clara shook her head slowly. "No. It's because this is where your father used to keep the girls." That wiped the grin from Travis's face. He took a step forward, now truly confused. "What are you talking about? What girls?" Clara reached into the drawer beside the bed and retrieved a stack of worn letters, held together with a satin ribbon that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. "Letters from my sister," she said, voice eerily steady. "She wrote them right before she died. Right here, in this room." He took them, instinctively reading the first few lines. The handwriting was neat, almost dainty, and addressed to a girl named Clara. The words painted a picture of a young woman terrified, describing strange men, threats, and a deal that had gone terribly wrong. "She said she didn't want to be part of it anymore," Clara said softly. "But your father wouldn't let her leave. Neither would mine." They were partners. In more than just business. Travis tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat like shards of glass. He flipped through more letters, growing more frantic. The imagery became darker. Mentions of locked doors, clients, drugs, blood. "Stop," he said, finally throwing the letters onto the floor. "This is insane. I don't know what this is, but it's not my problem." Clara stood and walked to the trunk again, this time opening it with deliberate calm. From beneath the photographs, she pulled out a thin, leather-bound journal. She handed it to him without a word. Inside were entries dated over 2 years, all written by someone named Lila, her sister, presumably. The entries detailed a hidden operation run out of multiple luxury properties owned by Travis's father and Clara's father, one that targeted vulnerable girls under the guise of rehabilitation. The journal described how Lila had uncovered the truth, tried to run, and ultimately vanished. Clara stared at him as he read, her eyes locked onto his face, watching the denial drain out like poison. "They buried her in the foundation of your father's old winery estate," she said, emotion finally breaking into her voice. "I was 12 when I found out. 12 when I disappeared." Travis sank into the armchair, his hands shaking. The entire bet, the wedding, Clara's silence. It had all been a setup, but not one of greed or revenge. It had been something older, colder. A calculated mission driven by grief and justice. Clara wasn't a pawn. She was the architect. "You could have gone to the police," he muttered. "Why do all this?" She gave a thin, humorless smile. "Because justice doesn't crawl through the front door wearing a badge. Sometimes it waits in silence, watches, then walks down the aisle and takes your name." The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thick with a history he had never known existed. He tried to stand, but Clara moved first, placing something heavy into his hands. A necklace, an antique locket, dusty and warm from her grip. He opened it. Inside was a photo of a younger Clara and Lila, arms wrapped around each other, grinning beneath a banner that read, "Reynolds Summer Camp." The date printed below it was 20 years ago. "I remember this," Travis said numbly. "That camp was ours. My dad built it for—" He stopped. His stomach dropped as realization began to crawl up his spine like ice water. Clara nodded. "Not for fun. For scouting. That's where they found most of them. Told their families they were giving them scholarships, mentorships. All lies." He stared at her. "So what now? You've told me. Is this where you leave?" Clara looked at him, expression unreadable. "I didn't marry you to hurt you," she said. "I married you so you'd see it with your own eyes, so you'd understand what blood you're soaked in." Her voice faltered for the first time. "I needed you to choose, redemption or silence." As the clock struck 3 in the morning, Travis sat in that suite surrounded by fragments of a past he had never known but had unknowingly inherited. The mirrors stayed covered. Clara eventually lay down, back turned to him, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The weight of the locket in his hand felt like a chain. Outside, thunder rumbled distantly. Somewhere beneath that storm, a reckoning had begun, and the first cracks had formed in the walls of the world he thought was his. Morning light broke through the curtains in thin golden lines, casting quiet streaks across the suite's cold marble floor, but there was nothing warm about the air. Travis woke up feeling like he hadn't slept at all. His thoughts raced in jagged, relentless loops. Flashes of letters, photographs. A child's journal written in fear. The words Clara had whispered, and most disturbingly, the knowing calm behind her eyes. She wasn't what he thought she was. She never had been. The woman who'd once appeared like a mute, dirt-covered beggar on a street corner had just shattered everything he believed about her, and about himself. Still dazed, he rolled out of bed, instinctively glancing to the side. The sheets next to him were cold. Clara was gone. Panic flared for a moment before he spotted the faintest movement near the window. She stood in her nightgown, facing the city skyline, perfectly still, her long hair loose around her shoulders like a curtain of shadows. He called her name softly, unsure if he wanted her to answer. She didn't turn, but she did speak. My real name isn't Clara. That single sentence sent a ripple through him. She finally turned to face him, and for the first time, he saw something behind her eyes. Not emptiness, not pain, but intelligence. Cutting, quiet, unshakable intelligence. My name is Celine Castell. You can Google it, but you won't find much anymore. They buried me a long time ago, along with my sister. The name hit him like a slap. Castell. That name had once dominated headlines tied to luxury textile empires and multinational philanthropy. The Castell sisters, Lila and Celine, were childhood prodigies raised by a tycoon father and a mother who taught violin to the elite. When Celine vanished at 13 following Lila's mysterious disappearance, the media had gone into a frenzy. There were rumors of cult involvement, of underground trafficking rings, of political blackmail, but no proof ever surfaced. The case had gone cold, buried under richer, flashier scandals. Travis sat down hard on the edge of the bed, head spinning. "You're her?" he asked, as if saying it out loud might reset reality. Celine nodded slowly. "I disappeared because I had to. They wanted me gone. They made sure no one would look for me after the first year. But I didn't vanish. I waited." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I spent years watching, learning. I lived on the edge of the world, blending in with the invisible. I learned things no child should ever know. But I remembered every name, every face, every promise broken. And yours was one of them." He blinked, confused. "I was a child. I didn't know any of this. But you were raised by the ones who did," she replied. "And now you wear their empire like a crown." Her words hit like a hammer. He couldn't argue. He didn't know how much his father had buried. How many deals, how many payoffs, how many lies were needed to keep the Reynolds name clean. But if Celine's story was true, and everything pointed to it being exactly that, then his inheritance was built on more than just greed. It was built on screams that were never heard. Celine walked to the vanity and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a thick manila folder. "I've been tracking them for years," she said. "Your father, my father, their partners. Some are already dead. Some fled. But some still hold power." She tossed the folder into his lap. He opened it and found documents, bank transfers, offshore accounts, real estate ledgers, police reports that had been altered, missing pages from the Castell investigation. There were even surveillance photos from recent years, blurry images of aging men meeting in secret, including one of his father with a Judge Travis recognized from a charity gala just last year. "This is enough to bury them," he whispered. Celine didn't answer. She only watched him. Then came the final blow. She pulled out a small USB drive from a hidden pocket in her gown. "This holds the original footage. Hidden cameras from the old camp. Proof. Undeniable. The kind that makes monsters burn." Travis's hands trembled as he held it. "Why give this to me?" he asked. "Why not release it yourself?" Celine leaned in close, her face just inches from his, her voice cold and deliberate. "Because I needed to know who you are, not just who raised you. I needed to see if you were worth saving. Or if you needed to be destroyed too." Her words cut deep, but deeper still was the realization that for the first time in his life, someone had looked at him not with envy, admiration, or contempt, but as a question that demanded an answer. "I married you because I knew you wouldn't walk away from a challenge," she continued. "You think this started as a bet, and it did. But the bet wasn't yours. It was mine. To see if a man bred from rot could still grow something decent. And now you have everything you need to choose." She turned and walked away again, disappearing into the hallway without another word, leaving Travis alone with 1,000 truths and the crushing weight of one decision. He stayed there for hours, reading every page in the folder, watching every grainy clip on the USB. Every time he thought he couldn't stomach another second, something in Celine's voice pulled him back. Her strength, her patience, her brilliance. She had sacrificed her life, her identity, her very name for justice. He'd thrown away his soul for a joke. The contrast was unbearable. Somewhere inside him, the man who'd thought this whole thing was just a cruel joke began to die. And in that silence, something else was born. Not guilt, Not yet, but the first flickers of purpose, of reckoning, of responsibility. Celine hadn't just exposed a past. She had lit a fuse, and Travis knew, as he stared at the woman he once mocked from the window, that he was now living in a world entirely of her design. A world where truth, no matter how long buried, always claws its way back to the surface. In the days that followed the revelation, Travis began to realize that the marriage he thought he controlled had shifted into something far more complex and far more dangerous. His home no longer felt like his own. At first, the changes were subtle. Staff began to resign quietly and without explanation, one by one, their replacements hired without his input. The new faces moved through the estate with cold efficiency, answering only to Celine. She rarely left the house, but her presence expanded invisibly, like ivy creeping up every wall. She no longer dressed in second-hand clothing or moved silently through rooms. Now she walked with quiet authority, in tailored black, her posture perfect, her gaze unflinching. Travis had built his empire by staying 3 moves ahead of everyone around him. But now he couldn't even predict what his wife would say at breakfast. He started avoiding the main rooms, retreating to the upper floors, hoping to carve out a sliver of space where he could still feel like the man he was before the wedding. But even in solitude, her influence bled in. Files disappeared from his study. His office calendar began to fill with mysterious meetings he hadn't scheduled. Emails were sent in his name that he never typed. At first, he tried confronting her. "What the hell are you doing with my staff?" he barked one morning. Celine didn't blink. "Replacing the ones who knew what your father did and said nothing." Her calm made it worse. Her conviction was a mirror that showed him a man scrambling to maintain control he'd never truly possessed. "You think you can just move in and take over my life?" he hissed. "It was never yours to begin with," she replied. "It belonged to the victims. You've just been renting it with blood money." He stormed out, but the anger didn't linger. Fear crept in instead. Fear that she wasn't just dismantling his life. She was redefining it. Then came the disappearances. Damien, the man who made the original bet with Travis, missed 2 board meetings in a row. His assistant claimed he was on a spontaneous overseas trip, but his passport had been scanned at no airports. Another close friend, Eli, was found disoriented in a parking lot, muttering about men in masks and voices from the past. He refused to speak to Travis and promptly vanished again. The worst came when Travis tried to meet with Harold, a longtime business associate of his father's. He arrived at the man's estate only to find the driveway barricaded and police tape fluttering in the wind. Suicide, the papers said. But the note was typed. Harold's daughter insisted he hadn't typed anything in years due to arthritis. When Travis asked Celine if she knew anything, she looked up from her tea and said, "Rot spreads quickly once the air hits it." That night, he drank until the bottle was empty and still couldn't sleep. He began having nightmares of footsteps behind him, phones ringing with no one on the other end, whispers coming from inside locked rooms. Desperate, Travis turned to his legal team, only to find that most of them had either quit or been reassigned. He demanded an internal audit of his accounts, but the request bounced between departments and eventually disappeared. His signature was found on a series of newly filed amendments to the company charter, documents he didn't remember signing. His assets were moving, shell companies were consolidating, properties were being liquidated. And the strangest part? No laws were being broken. Every move was clean, strategic, even genius. Someone was outplaying him at a game he had spent years mastering. And that someone was now his wife. Celine never threatened him directly, never raised her voice, never played the role of the vengeful woman. But she didn't need to. She was methodical, precise, and terrifying in her restraint. Travis began to feel like a guest in his own existence, a figurehead with no real power, a puppet dangling from threads she didn't bother hiding anymore. Even the media began to shift. Tabloids that once fawned over his every move began publishing pieces about ethical investigations and hidden scandals. Anonymous sources started leaking footage, grainy videos of elite parties with questionable guests, whispers of hush money and buried lawsuits. His father's legacy, once immortalized in marble and bronze, began to crumble beneath headlines soaked in shame. Travis tried to push back, to schedule interviews and deny the allegations, but every attempt was undercut by new revelations. The pressure mounted. The board grew restless. Shareholders began demanding answers. And still, Celine never blinked. One evening, Travis followed her. She left the estate without notice, dressed in plain clothing, heading toward the city in an unmarked car. He tailed her to a private clinic on the edge of town, one surrounded by tall fences and security cameras. He watched from a distance as she entered, greeted by a doctor who seemed to know her well. After an hour, she emerged with a small boy, no older than 5. They walked together to a nearby bench and sat quietly. The boy rested his head on her shoulder. Travis's mind reeled. Was he hers? Someone else's? Another victim's child taken in as her own? He didn't approach. He just watched. And for the first time in weeks, he saw something in Celine's expression that wasn't cold or strategic. It was tenderness. When she returned that night, he asked, "Who was the boy?" She didn't deny it. "Lila's son," she said. She hid her pregnancy. They didn't know. "I found him 3 years ago in a state ward listed as a John Doe." He was barely speaking. Travis sat in stunned silence. "You've been protecting him all this time? Justice doesn't always wear a badge," she said again. "Sometimes it wears scars and walks slowly, but it gets there." The words echoed from that first night like a prophecy now fulfilled. Travis began to unravel, not from guilt alone, but from the slow, seeping recognition that Celine had never been a victim. She was a force, a system, a reckoning wrapped in silk. And while he had once thought himself a master of manipulation, he now understood he was simply the final piece on her board, a king already cornered, waiting for checkmate. The storm came quietly, not in a flash of lightning or the roar of thunder, but in the stillness before both, unnerving and suffocating. Travis could feel its arrival in the way the staff began to avoid eye contact, in the way the house echoed differently, like the walls themselves had begun to breathe. He had become a stranger in the empire his father built, a man surrounded by wealth but utterly bankrupt in power. Days blurred into nights without rest, his thoughts fraying at the edges with every headline. Every anonymous envelope slid beneath his door, every trace of Celine's quiet orchestration. He had stopped asking her questions, not because he had surrendered, but because he finally understood that the answers would no longer be offered. They would be revealed when they needed to be, not a moment sooner. And that moment arrived one evening as he sat alone in the great hall of the estate, staring at a portrait of his father that had hung for decades, a symbol of pride and intimidation. It was then that Celine entered, dressed not in mourning or defiance, but in pure white, barefoot, with a calmness that chilled the air. In her hand was a folder, thick, aged, and tied with a black ribbon. It bore his family crest, something she should never have had. She placed it on the table without a word, then stepped back, folding her arms. Travis hesitated before opening it, but when he did, the breath caught in his throat. Inside were records, contracts, personal letters, private journal entries in his father's handwriting, each more damning than the last. They didn't just confirm the trafficking ring. They outlined it in grotesque detail. Dates, names, payment schedules, even logistics of how and where the victims were moved. But that wasn't what made his hands tremble. It was the final envelope, one labeled in faded red ink, "For Travis, on the day he inherits." Inside was a handwritten letter addressed to him. His father's voice bled through the paper like a ghostly echo, filled with arrogance and twisted pride. In it, his father explained the empire's true foundation. Not real estate, not investments, but control, fear, and silence. He spoke of legacy, of grooming Travis to take the reins one day, and of the necessity of making hard, brutal choices for the family's continued dominance. Travis's stomach turned. He felt hollow, a shell constructed from lies and blood. All those years he'd spent admiring the man, emulating his methods, trying to outpace his shadow. It had all been a grooming for something monstrous. "Why didn't you destroy this?" he asked Celine, voice ragged. Why give it to me? She looked at him with something resembling pity. Because you needed to see it for yourself. Not to punish you, but to show you what you were born from. You asked me once if this was revenge. It isn't. This is inheritance. Yours. And now you must choose what to do with it. Her words struck like thunderclaps. He stood, pacing the room, the weight of the folder in his hands suddenly unbearable. So that's it, he snapped. Expose my family? Ruin myself? Burn everything down? Is that what you want? She shook her head. I want justice. But justice doesn't always come wrapped in flames. Sometimes it's in the choice not to become what made you. He staggered back to the portrait and stared at his father's cold, painted eyes. For a moment he saw himself in them. That scared him more than anything Celine had ever said. Slowly, methodically, he picked up a poker from the fireplace and drove it straight through the canvas. The glass cracked like a gunshot, and the silence that followed felt holy. When he turned back, Celine was gone. He found her hours later in the study, standing beside the boy, Lila's son, who was quietly coloring in a sketchbook. Celine's hand rested on his shoulder, her expression unreadable. Travis approached cautiously, uncertain of the boundary between them now. He knows, she said without looking up. Not everything, but enough. I've told him the truth in pieces shaped for his age. One day, he'll know the whole story. Travis knelt beside the boy and looked at the drawing. It was a house, this house, surrounded by dark figures. In the corner was a girl with long hair and a scar on her cheek, standing in front of a blazing fire. Beside her stood a man with a torn suit, holding the girl's hand. Travis felt something shift in his chest, something foreign. Regret, maybe, or redemption clawing its way out of the dirt. What's your name? He asked the boy gently. The child looked up and replied, My name is Lyric. Travis swallowed hard. Celine placed a hand on his shoulder. He's all that's left of her, of the future. You wanted a bet, Travis? Here's the real one. Teach him to be better than any of us. The next morning, Travis made the first of many calls. He issued a public statement denouncing his father's legacy, announcing a full audit of every company linked to the Reynolds estate. He authorized the release of the footage, the documents, the letters. He handed it all over to a federal investigation, even knowing what it would cost him. Stocks plummeted. His name became synonymous with scandal. Board members resigned in droves. His former friends fled like rats from a sinking ship. But something strange happened in the wreckage. Survivors began to come forward. Quiet voices, now empowered, began naming names, adding details, strengthening the case. A movement formed from the ashes. One Celine had spent her life quietly preparing. In the final hours before his arrest, an inevitable consequence of complicity, even unknowing, Travis sat on the porch with Lyric, watching the sun rise over the charred remains of the life he once led. Celine stood behind them, silent, steady, like the foundation of a world slowly being rebuilt. She had never needed revenge. She had needed a reckoning. And through fire, through shame, through the slow unraveling of every illusion, she had delivered it.